All right, folks, good morning.
Good morning. All right, guys. Get started right now. Thank you.
Let me ask you, if you're not staying, you would finish your conversation in the hallway so we can get started in here. Got quiet. All right, my name's Scott Ray. Glad to be here with you. I come from Southern California, so I'm still a little bit on West Coast time. So my day's just getting started. But it's a good thing for you. I'm a morning person, so this is the best time of the day. So I'd like for us to have a little bit of conversation about ethics in the workplace. There's an awful lot to cover, so we can just get a start on this. But I'd like to leave a few minutes for some questions if you have specific ethical dilemmas, scenarios that you'd like to talk about. We'll have some time to talk about those. Let me ask, just to get us started, with the person next to you, describe an ethical dilemma that you've had in your workplace at any point in your career. Describe what you think is the most challenging ethical dilemma you've had in your workplace. 2 minutes with the person next to you. All right, go.
We can do it three ways. The chairman of the first workers was asking for a loan from the country. He was not the only owner of the employees. And engaged him. I was uncomfortable because it was not going to the board. This is going to the CEO.
All right.
The chairman said, sorry, not the chairman. The president of the company. That was it. I didn't feel like that was the right thing to do. Were you asking how you Scott's helping you. What I did, how it worked out.
Yeah, you're right. I think the hardest part about ethics, especially when you're given directives from your superior, is that it's always from your action training. What you have to do from your pocketbooks is different when you're in leadership chair versus leadership chair, because when you're having to say, well, how do I handle this? This is also the same person who's supposed to be chair. I mean, I owe you this person. I am an employee by this person. That's good. So this person is they paid me to help me do my job so I can give them feedback. This is how I feel about this. That's that's a very complex. That's a really complex thing. People face with things, especially leaders that work for a company.
All right. Let's let me hear one or two of them. If you don't mind going public with this, more than you already have.
Okay, so I presented one. I'm a chief financial officer of a company, or was at that time, the chief financial officer of the company. The chairman of the board asked for a loan from the company. The president of the company told me to make him the loan, but I felt like that was not following correct protocol, in that the board and the other owners were not being informed and asked their opinion, and there wasn't time to do it. So it was an ethical dilemma for me because I felt like it was not right.
Very good. Now, usually bypassing the board when it's called for is not a great idea. Okay, good. Others? Yes.
I was managing a division of the company, and the head of sales came to me and said, you have to sign this invoice for $1 million for somebody to do maintenance. I said, do we do maintenance? He said, no, we'll do it next year, but this zeroes out his taxes, so he won't have to pay taxes if we do this, and then we'll just sort of do the maintenance next year. And I said, that's like illegal. And he said, no, we do this every year, it's okay, and if we don't, we'll lose the business. And I said, we better lose the business. And that guy wound up going to jail for 7 years for tax avoidance. Later on, about 5 years later.
Yeah. Excellent. Very good. Right? And very good that you both took the stance that you in the midst of that. Well, thank you. We'll have a chance at the end to talk a little bit more about those. What I want to do is just lay some foundations for a Christian ethic for the workplace, and deal with some of the challenges that we have to having a distinctly Christian ethic in the workplace. This has been on the front pages of the business media's attention for some time. That we could probably ask and answer that question in most eras. But Fortune, I think, described this as a crisis of confidence. Business Week described it as a crisis of trust. Which what they're describing here is not something that the law can address. What they're describing is something that's fundamentally an ethical scenario. But that's not the way the ideological founders of our market system saw business. Adam Smith was very clear that business was parallel to the professions of law and medicine, and today I probably add mental health to that. Although he didn't quite go as far as to say that business men and women had fiduciary obligations to their customers, it was pretty close to that. That the idea was that with your product or service, you serve the community through that product or service, and if you did that service well, similar to a physician or a lawyer, or today we would say a therapist, you could expect a fair or reasonable standard of living. But for Smith, although it's not clear to me that he was a Christian, I think he definitely had very strong moral roots. In fact, most people I think don't realize that he wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments about 10 years before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations was to be an application on a big scale of Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. So the idea that our market system could exist without a set of sort of inbred moral constraints, I think was completely foreign to Adam Smith. But he saw business as having intrinsic value in and of itself, not for what it provided, but simply by virtue of it being good business. However, that's not the way business is seen today. I think this is still the case. It's been this way for probably, I've been paying attention to this for about the last 20 years. Now, it's been that way since then. But I think if you take an inventory of popular media, films, and television, the most common villain today is the corporate executive. And I think that's still true today. And I think if you watch some of the presidential campaigns, it'd be very interesting to see how that comes out again as that unfolds. But clearly, the idea, the way the culture views business is that short-term greed is what they're after and what they're about. The idea that a company could actually be involved in long-term service or actually anything that's long-term thinking, I think is foreign to most media observers of ethics in the workplace. And the idea that greed is good, please don't attribute that to Adam Smith. He is turning over in his grave every time that's attributed to him. He had nothing to do with that. He would have shuddered at the idea that was attributed to him. That was coined by Ivan Boesky in the late 1970s in a speech of all places at the University of California, Berkeley Business School, which is probably one of the last places you might expect to hear that come out. Now, one of the ways that people deal with ethical tensions in the workplace is what I would call this dual morality. Here's an example of it. Which of the following statements do you think is more the case? A sudden submission to personal ethics would bring about the greatest economic upheaval in history. What's meant by that is if everybody decided to practice Christian ethics, we instantly become non-competitive. Albert Carr wrote this in the Harvard Business Review years ago in a classic piece that sort of was the foundation for this notion of the dual morality. Or the statement that the late Norman Vincent Peale said, integrity pays, you don't have to cheat to win. Okay, the idea is that good ethics is always good business in terms of profitability. Or consider this statement. Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, who claimed to be a Christian, put it this way. He said, my priorities are God first, family second, McDonald's hamburgers third. And everybody thought that was great if he'd stopped there. But he said, when I go to work on Monday morning, that order reverses. What that suggests to me is he had two different sets of priorities, two different sets of ethical values, one for the workplace and one for his private life. And it was though he practiced the adage, church on Sunday, work on Monday, and never the two shall come together. Or to put it like this is what Carr makes this point. My point is that in their office lives, they cease to be private citizens. They become game players who must be guided by a somewhat different set of ethical standards. In fact, Carr equated business to a poker game that just simply has a different set of rules. Where in poker, bluffing, lying, deception is all part of the rules of the game. And Carr argued that business is analogous to that business has its own rules of the game, that if you don't play by those, you have no shot at succeeding. And in fact, he said, you have a different set of rules for business than how you would treat your neighbors and friends and family. Okay? That's, I think, a classic statement of the dual morality that I think is still widely practiced in our culture today. Right? Now, I'll give you, again, with the person next to you, you give about 2 minutes. What would you say in response to these statements that are espousing this kind of dual morality? Okay, go, 2 minutes.
I think there's a systemic issue in our nation. Laws and facts. If I come in the workplace and say something that's not conservative, it's okay. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would go to the workplace and say, well, yeah, you gotta preach those values. But if I'm a bigot or somebody else, if I come as a conservative, it's almost like the role is reversed. It's made it extremely complicated. You're almost like, yeah, I gotta get mindful of what I say. Kind of like when the guy was at the state training, he said, the guy came in and said, hey, you tone it down for the God thing. Because we're a public company. Well, but somebody else can come in and probably say other things. Like, well, I can't go. We don't want to really go and talk to them because they're potentially a protected class. Or I used to have some issue with well, we need to handle that person a little different. You know, I have that issue working. Yeah, let's give a little bit more slack. Maybe we don't want to really push them to get there. She pulled that policy. Is that why you brought up this? She would say that. But if you go in and say, you know what,
Thank you for that. I really all right. What would you say in response to this?
quick. I'm sorry.
I think there's a false dichotomy that's
Okay.
been made between the secular, or the Greeks used to call it the secular and the sacred.
Okay.
In Christianity, I think there's such a dichotomy.
Okay.
Even what we
All right.
call secular is sacred.
I'm glad you make that point. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this afternoon, but I don't think there's any such thing as a secular job. Right? Because if it's true that the earth is the Lord's, and what we mean by secular is sort of a place where God is not, then there's no such thing. In fact, I get a big kick out of people who say, can you help me, help me think about how I take God to work? I said, really? You're asking me that question? I said, did it occur to you that God might already be there and well ahead of you, which is the norm? Okay, so I think that is a false dichotomy.
I like what Mark Albers said in the panel, that your work's your ministry. And if your work is your ministry, there's no flipping. We were saying Ray Kroc was a hamburger man. That's where all the flipping made.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, now I think we need to be careful to spell out exactly what we mean when we say your work is your ministry.
Yeah.
Because I'll bring this out this afternoon too, so.
Well, you know, there
Come-
is a,
come back to
there is
that.
a switch point there. Is,
Mhm.
is your work your ministry or is work your ministry?
Right. Okay, no, it's good, that's a helpful distinction.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a thing that when you look at character, and this character is a composite of attributes, and has a way of your being. If a person is committed, then a lot of times your commitment is driven based on where you are at the moment or what context you're functioning in. So, two different ethical standards, it depends on where you measure. Because if you measure at the level of commitment and truth, if I'm committed to work because I'm at the job, and if I'm committed to my family because I'm at home, is that a dual standard, or is that a commitment?
No, that's actually a really helpful distinction. I think we can, we have, let's say the application of our ethic looks different in different places.
Same attribute.
Right, same value. Right, same trait, same virtue, yeah. Because compassion looks different to my wife and children than it does to my students. Right? And my family is suggesting it better look different. Right? So, but that doesn't mean I have a dual standard. But the application of it is different. But then that's a helpful distinction. Okay? How else would you respond to this?
Yeah, just, and I think this has already been said to a certain extent, but we have learned to compartmentalize our Christianity. And just, I've been involved in discipleship ministry in local church for 30 years, and I think sometimes, and some of it I think is the church fault, because we almost teach that Sunday morning or weekend service is the pinnacle of what does it mean to be a Christian, instead of the basically the fuel that teaches us how to live the rest of the week.
See, this is the stuff that just makes me nuts. Because my seminary students fall prey to this. Because they spend the vast majority of their time equipping the people they serve in a very small minority of their lives. Right? And so when I talk about the term whole life discipleship, what that means is that we spend the majority of our time addressing what people do with the majority of their lives. Which is, if you just put a pencil to it, in terms of just the hours. Most people who work full time spend probably by a factor of 10 more hours in the workplace than they do in a church building. Which would seem to me to suggest that the primary crucible in which God is going to shape people spiritually is not the church building. Now, that's not to minimize what goes on here, but it's the workplace. And I'm beating on my seminary students constantly to say, help the folks you serve get their antenna up so they can actually perceive what God might be doing to their character in the workplace.
Well, there's and I can't remember the book. He's a professor at Wheaton, or was a professor at Wheaton, and he made the comment, in discipleship, small groups, stuff like that. And he said, transformation does not happen in a small group. That was his first part of the statement. At first I disagreed. But what he said was, what happens in small groups gives you the tools for transformation to happen the rest of the week.
That's right.
And I'm going, that's absolutely right.
That's right.
When I felt through it.
That's right. We have a church in our community that is right along the city they're in has a major it's a major route on the big 4th of July parade, and they always open their facilities to anybody that has water, use their restrooms, and anything. And all their volunteers are wearing these T-shirts. They have the logo of the church on the front, and then in the back, as you can see them walking out of the church, it has this phrase: "The church has now left the building." And I think they got that right. They've left the building to their arena, to their vocation or their arena of service in whatever arena God's calling them. Okay, here I think one of the reasons, not the only one, but I think one of the main theological reasons that we ought to think about to counter this is that anybody who practices this kind of dual morality, I don't see how you square that with the notion of the lordship of Christ over all of life. And and it's not like we're compartmentalizing a small area. I mean, this is the majority of what we do with our waking hours that we're compartmentalized. I think one of the main reasons we do this, not only among the Christian community, but in the culture at large, is because we don't actually believe that good ethics and good business are related. Now, I don't think Norman Vincent Peale was necessarily right that integrity always pays. Because if that were true, everybody would do it all the time, right? Unless you're an idiot. But the reality is that ethical behavior in the short run is almost always costly. Right? Not always, but the track record of it, the reason we have ethical dilemmas is precisely because there's a cost to ethical behavior. Okay? Now, in the long run, I think that's a different story. In the short term, there's a cost. In the long run, I think it's generally good business because it engenders trust. But I think there are lots of exceptions to this. Right? There are some companies that are so dominant in their industries that they can act unethically almost with impunity, and the market is simply not going to punish them for it. Right? Now, it's different today because I do think with the advent of and the proliferation of social media, it's a lot tougher for companies to go unpunished once ethical behavior becomes public. So I think it's a little different, but I think it's a little tougher to maintain that. But I think in general, the idea of that good ethics fosters trust is generally true in the long run. I think the main issue today, especially if you're with a public company, is that the results are almost always viewed through short-term lenses. Now, private companies, I think, have an advantage in the ability to think long term. I think and that's not to say that public companies don't think long term, but there is much more of a short term focus in those. Yes.
Well, I think there's a perception sometimes that short term is of value, but I think it really creates problems because I think the companies that endure really are looking at
That's right.
at our faith being continuous and really faith with customers, but the companies are made of people. You see, like Wells Fargo was a company of people, all of a sudden creates 5 million false accounts just to hype their stock and make them look like they're opening accounts. So there's a company that had some long-term faith, but has some real short-term management thinking that really hurt that
It
faith.
did hurt them.
But I think long run, it's a misnomer to say short-term you get advantage because you're really hurting yourself. But look what happened to Facebook. They started spying on us and doing things. There's an outcry, and now they're backing off the kinds of information they hold about us because they realize that was going to hurt them long term.
Right.
So they have to get into a whole different view of
It
what
is,
that
yeah.
long-term value
Yes,
is.
it takes, it's a different mindset that has to be done. I think, I would suggest that the connection between trust and trustworthiness, I think, is just one of a handful of really significant virtues that I think that successful market activity not only requires, but also nurtures in many cases. Now, I think they're tangible things. If you've worked in low trust environments, you're aware of all the monitoring and regulation that has to take place. But I think they're intangible things too. Low trust environments generally have employees that are less committed to their work. They're less receptive to change, less willing to go the extra mile. And I think on a bigger picture, instead of greed establishing a vicious cycle, I would argue that trust establishes a virtuous cycle. Our market system has always been grounded on trust, openness, fairness, and a whole other set of virtues. In fact, think about all the transactions that take place every day that are premised on trust. It's millions and millions of them are premised on trust. I remember I had a student of mine who came to our school from Ethiopia. He'd never been outside basically never been outside his village in Ethiopia. He was on second day he was with us. I took him out for lunch. And when the bill came, I put my credit card down. He literally asked me, he said, "What's that?" And he just watched with this sort of astonishment as a credit transaction took place. I'm sure he thought that, I've been here 2 days and my ethics professor is stealing our lunch. Because he didn't understand how American Express trusts me to pay the bill, restaurant trusts American Express to pay them, and that I could therefore pay for my meal with just a signature. And he said, I'm so astonished to hear this. And he said, in the village that I came from, the seller would keep one hand on the product, and the buyer would keep one hand on the money, and they both released them at the same time. And I said, it's no wonder your economy has been crippled, because your transaction costs are off the charts. They're so high because nobody trusts each other. And I think that's been one of the best parts of our market system is how it's engendered trust among strangers. Smith actually, this I think is just what astonishes people today. But Adam Smith described how commerce polishes and softens human beings. What we forget is that prior to Adam Smith, people essentially killed each other and resorted to violence in order to get the things that they needed in order to survive. Okay? Today, countries with thriving economies generally don't go to war with each other. Because why do you think there's been peace between India and Pakistan for years? Because it's too costly for business. It's too disruptive. Now, let me skip ahead here just for a bit. One of the things I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with this, Francis Fukuyama is a social historian. And his book on trust is really insightful. I'd recommend this to you for your reading. The point that he's making, I think, has been so insightful that economic growth depends on the degree of interpersonal trust that exists in a culture. And he describes the difference between low trust and high trust cultures. In low trust cultures, very few people outside blood relations are trusted. That's why the clan is the extended family, or the clan is the primary economic unit. But in high trust cultures, there's a high degree of trust outside the family. Fukuyama points at the advent of market systems. He points particularly to the proliferation of churches and synagogues and religious organizations that enabled people to do business with essentially strangers outside of their family, because they had learned to trust them through the relationships they'd had in their congregations. And he said, his point is, basically, without religious organizations, market systems would have been much, much slower to develop than at the pace that they did. Now, one other, I think, common confusion that exists in this area is the difference between ethics and compliance. I spent about 15 years as a consultant for the healthcare system in Southern California, and we had what they called an integrity office. And I was not. For some reason, I did ethics consulting. I was not in the loop on the integrity office, which I'm still kind of puzzled about. But one day I asked our chief integrity officer, I said, "Tell me exactly what you do." I was fascinated with this response. She said, "My sole responsibility is to make sure that our executives and managers don't go to jail." And that's sort of a double take. If I help me understand that really the bar is that low for an integrity office, I'd like to think that the bar is a little higher than ending the calendar year without indictments being handed down. Part of that is because at that time, the rules for healthcare financing were changing so often that it was actually, I think, quite possible to break the law inadvertently, but not repeatedly over a long period. But I thought how interesting that she considered the law the moral ceiling and not the moral floor. And the questions of ethics have to do with how far above and beyond what the law requires are we required to go to maintain ethical standards. Now, the law is a helpful guide, and there may be times when it's justified when the law conflicts with a moral value. Right? I found in the marketplace that's not all that often. I was serving on a jury one time. I did have, and the judge asked me, he said, I understand you work at a religious college. I said, yes. He said, do you think you can follow the law? I said, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Turned out what he meant was, do you believe that there's a law of God that's higher than the law of the land? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do believe that. But I'm not so sure that those two things are going to conflict in my jury service. Maybe I should have been a little harsher on that. I would have gotten out of it. Ended up being the foreman for the thing.
He was interviewing you.
I think so.
Yeah, that's funny.
But compliance is on conformity with externally imposed standards. Ethics is something that's based on self-governance. It's the ethical values that define and structure what an organization is about. That's the difference. And in my view, if I had my way, the CEO we'd change that acronym to the Chief Ethics Officer of the organization. Because if the person who signs the checks is doing something different, then nothing you put on the walls, no training will have any kind of impact. This is why I think the real solutions for the quandaries in the marketplace come from ethics, because they ask questions that the law can't. Yeah.
How often have you seen it where leaders, I was just thinking, the VP of Exxon was up there, I was thinking about how many decisions he's had to make in his career, because you're talking about countless lives that he's responsible for.
Right.
That downline, and so where he's faced with, this might be the gray area. I might be pushing the gray area, but if I can push profits in the gray area, I can keep all these families fed versus sending people on the workforce with no job. There's this huge pivot in leadership.
Two things on that. One is, my seminary mentor used to say that a mist in the pulpit makes for a fog in the pew. And so what's gray in the executive suite turns out to be really gray, probably grayer than you want among the rank and file.
Got it.
I think the other. Let me leave that.
Okay.
I do think that ultimately, this is about how we view our character and ultimately how we view the definition of a good life and a good person. And if I'm doing this with just a bunch of non-believing business folks, I'll go back to the ancient philosophers who were totally committed to the idea prior to when the New Testament was written. But I think they may have gotten some of this from the Old Testament. The idea that you can have a good life without being a person of character would have shocked them. And I think there's a modicum of that that takes root in our culture today. Because think about the person who's at the top of their pile in their business or in their field, but is on their third or fourth wife, alienated from their children, with very few people they would call close friends. And you wonder, I would hesitate to call that person a success, and I think if we think about it, most people I think would be likewise. My teaching colleague, I'll close with this. My teaching colleague was a long-time civil business litigator, and he worked for one of the top people in his field when he was a young attorney. This gentleman, he was on his third wife. He spent all his time at the office, walked over people to get where he was. When he had a heart attack, the only person he could persuade to come pick him up at the hospital and take him home after he'd been discharged was his secretary. None of his family were the least, not only did they not come to visit, they weren't the least bit interested in being a part of his life when he needed them most. He was at the top of his field, and I'd say at the bottom of his life. And if anybody's a good example of somebody who climbed the ladder but only to realize it's leaning on the wrong wall, that was him. And I think ultimately what we talk about ethics in the workplace is less about dilemmas and decisions and more about how we understand a good person and a good life. Because a good life does not require that we be at the top of our profession. It requires that we be committed to excellence in all that we do. It does require that we be men and women of character. I love how the ancient philosophers put it. Aristotle said, happiness is an activity of your soul in accordance with virtue, which I think is precisely what Jesus meant when he said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to forfeit his soul? Yes.
So, a little bit of open tangent, but since our schools don't teach biblical ethics anymore, and they don't teach ethics or morals, period, where do you think we're going as a society as the next generation
Well,
coming through the pipeline?
I've never considered the schools to be to have the primary responsibility for teaching my children.
I don't disagree with that.
And that's why I think, our churches have to, we have to do better at establishing character. And we have to do it in a way that directly confronts some of the things that our kids are being taught in their schools. Not everything that they're getting in the public schools is useless. I mean, there's some good stuff. And I think because the folks in our school system recognize a lot of the same virtues and values that we would hold dear. But they recognize some that I think are directly contrary to Scripture. I don't expect the public schools to teach biblical ethics. I expect them to teach character and some sort of moral education. But that's primarily, our job in the family and the local church to be doing that. I'm not optimistic about a renewal of character apart from a really significant religious revival. Because our culture has lost the will to actually to forge young men and women of character. Because to forge character requires particular ethics. It requires naming evil for what it is. It requires being intolerant with certain types of evil and certain types of behavior, which our culture, I think, shows no inclination to be doing.
We go to the bar line.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the thoughts that occurred to me as I've listened to your presentation is that anything good requires sacrifice. And sacrifice is giving up something for something better. And Jesus was the absolute epitome of that, giving his life. Business ethics, which is kind of what we're talking about, how does my religious beliefs affect me in business? It requires truth, and that requires shedding light and transparency. That's what we can do as business people, is make sure that truth is highlighted and that it's evident, and we can do that any day, anytime, and it will, and generally speaking, I don't care what religious background you come from, most people despise hypocrites. And you shed light, and that usually takes care of that.
Yeah, and if you're not being transparent, usually the question of why I'm not is very revealing. Yes.
Well, this might be going where no one wants to go, but when you say ethics and morality to teach it, how can it be taught if it's not under a biblical standard? Secondly, this all drives me to, as a Christian, being asked, how can you vote for Donald Trump? How can you support him? He's not a man of good character.
think it's time to break for lunch. I got the time elapsed a few minutes. Let me answer your first question,
Okay.
and I may take a stab at the second. I think the Bible teaches that God has revealed His moral standards, both in His Word and in His world. Catholics call this natural law. Paul describes this as the law written on our heart, whether you're a believer or not. So I think there's a reservoir of shared values, shared moral principles, but I think our culture still largely holds, or else all Sheol will be breaking loose all the time. Even something as simple as driving on the correct side of the road presumes the moral values of respect for life and property, right? Because we assume that somebody who barrels the wrong way down the freeway has respect for neither of those. So I think it is possible to teach ethics and morality without the necessity of chapter and verse to underscore it. Okay? Now, all the better if you can do that, of course. But we have large pockets of our culture where once you invoke chapter and verse, you lose your audience. Now, I'll make one comment on your second question. I was at a panel in early December, so public radio, LA Public Radio panel on immigration, and because it was called Religion and Refugees. And there was a rabbi, a Muslim woman, a Christian with world vision, and I was the quote evangelical professor, which there was sort of two strikes against me in that crowd. Every question I had, afterwards, at least half a dozen people approached me afterwards, and their only question was, how can you be an evangelical and support Donald Trump? In their view, that was, they just didn't see how that fit together. My response was that I said, of course, character matters. And my question for them was, at the risk of being a hypocrite, I want to make sure that you didn't support Bill Clinton during his character lapses and say, well, it was his policies that matter. Okay? I think if character counts, it counts. End of story. Now, I think that's not to say that people with that character can't also do some good things, but I worry about what's happening to the gospel with this, and I worried about it, 20 years ago because Bill Clinton claimed to be a believer as well. So I think we have to be consistent, sort of on both sides of that. So anyway, I think that's probably as much as I ought to get into before lunch. That's what I get the big bucks. All right. Hey, thanks for showing up, and I'll be with you guys thundering this afternoon. I'm looking forward to that.